It's great to be here. It's great to be here again at a quarterly meeting and to see so many familiar faces. Dr. Duke, or Nell, as I often refer to her, is always, I think, really encourages us today to stay the course. And in terms of research and in terms of our coaching, but also remember that Nell often talks about evolving. So we're evolving while we're staying the course. And Leslie and Amanda and I would just like to share with you one way in which part of our work as professional developers and coaches is developing. So I'm going to share my screen, and while I do that, Erin's going to talk about the way that all of us are going to be up at the top of the screen.
Yeah, so whomever is on a computer, I think that's most of you. I know some of you are in a room though, and someone is kind of controlling a main screen. So if that's you, could you go to view options, everyone, up at the top of your Zoom window? So if you click that little 9 box image in the very top right corner, what we're going to do is once Susan shares her screen, you'll get to select a view where you'll see her screen, but you'll see everybody else too who's talking. So I have standard, I have side-by-side speaker, and I have side-by-side gallery as my options. If I click standard, I see Susan's screen and her slides right now, but I also see the last 4 people who have talked up at the top of my Zoom screen. So most of you should probably see that as well. You can also do side-by-side gallery where you'll see them down on the left, but side-by-side standard is nice for me because I can then, their faces just stay there. Right now you don't see them because they haven't said anything yet, but as soon as they start to talk, you'll just keep their faces right at the top while you see their slides, which are just nice visuals for us as we hear their authentic conversation. Thank you.
So today we're going to talk about how we have used the resource examination tool and our mission statement to make some revisions to the intensives. Many of you have attended an intensive, and many of you are going to be attending one in the spring. So hopefully this will give you a little insight into the planning of those intensive. And as Dr. Duke often says in the Kickoff Institute, when she's talking about, you know, the top 10 things about the 10 essentials, one of them is that the development is in the details. And she's talking about the development of the instructional practices and how detailed each bullet is, even down to the very vocabulary that they use in the essentials. But today we're going to talk about the details in any kind of professional learning that you do and how important really that is. So, you know, Erin and Amanda and Heather, who's also part of that intensive, and Leslie and I got together about 6 weeks before the intensive. And that's when we like to start planning, about 6 weeks. And we have this long things to do list that goes week to week to week. And one of the things on that list is to review the materials that are going to be used for the intensive. And so when we got to that, about, I think it's the second week in of planning, so about 5 weeks before the intensive, we started thinking about the materials that we're going to use for the professional learning day, which is the second day. We always have a day when we bring in a researcher to talk about the focus of the intensive. Oftentimes the focus is read aloud, sometimes it's writing. We've had small group focus. So whatever the focus is. And so we were starting to think about that second day. And we have always in the past used a read aloud source for the read aloud intensives. And this was going to be one of our read aloud intensives. So we've always used a source, the Ramped Up Read Aloud book by Maria Walther. And it's a very nice book. It has 101 books listed in it. And it lists these books. There's something about each book in the 2 or 3 page spread about the books. And then it always sets a purpose for the reading. It has good questions for during reading and after reading, and several ideas for extending the experience. But as we were starting to think about this, we thought, let's look at this resource in terms of the resource examination tool that we developed and shared with you in August. And let's make sure that this resource is really what we want it to be. So we were especially interested in the alignment. And we looked at the alignment and we realized it was aligned to the building or district improvement plan or their goals for the year, because, Amanda had spent time talking to the principal, and the principal had chosen read alouds as the topic for the intensive. So we knew it was aligned to their goals. We didn't know specifically how it was aligned to their curriculum, but certainly to their instructional goals. It's aligned to the learning standards in a subset of the learning standards, basically around reading and some standards around speaking and listening. And it is definitely aligned to the essentials, but not so much to the current research about the benefits of using culturally responsive literature in the classroom. And then when we got to equity, we really kind of realized, oh, this is an area that we really need to think about, because the school is really committed to equity. But when we look at the books, there's 101 books, but only 11 of them might be considered culturally responsive texts in some ways. And typically it was that the main characters were diverse, but they were doing things that any character, any person could do, regardless of their race or ethnicity. And there were a few that focused on historical or cultural themes. But so out of that, only 10% might be considered culturally responsive texts. And so we saw, there's poor alignment with the vision of equity box of the resource examination tool. And even more so, there's really not very good alignment with our mission statement that we've worked so hard to develop over the last year. Especially the bullet that says, we as coaches are trying to cultivate a learning environment dedicated to justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so the Ramped Up Read Aloud book as a resource really was not doing as much in this area as we wanted to be, in order to maintain our commitment to the use of a resource examination tool to really examine the materials we're using for professional development, and to our mission statement. And so I said to Amanda and Leslie and Heather, I've been thinking about this, and here are some of the books, other resources we might use. And Amanda said, I have that resource on my shelf right now. It's called Rebellious Read Alouds. And it has 45 books discussed in it with lesson ideas. Each book is given a short summary. The author gives her view of the book, why she chose it. There's focus questions, and then there's a plan of action. And so we thought, oh my goodness, maybe this book would be better than Ramped Up Read Aloud. And so we took the time to quickly order those books. Liberty got those orders to us in, I think, about 2 days. And we read through them. And then at our next meeting, we talked about this book in terms of the resource examination tool. And so when we were looking at this, we thought, here are the section titles, and you can see how these section titles really focus on lots of the things that we've been talking about, identity and diversity and social justice ideas. And the author ties all of the books to the social justice standards. And those standards are identity, diversity, justice, and action. And not every book focuses on all of those, but every book focuses on at least one of them. If you look for all books, students are encouraged to make a plan of action. And for example, when they're reading this book, Hair Twins, they're encouraged, which is about a father and a daughter who style their hairs in different ways on different days for different purposes. And then at the end, these are some of the questions that the author really asks you to consider in terms of identity and diversity. Like, what can you do to support a classmate who might have a new haircut or a hairstyle? But even as important, in what ways can we stand up for friends who are treated unkindly for their hairstyles? And this whole idea of doing more research about different cultures, how they style their hair or use head coverings. So this was one of the books that was in the resource. So just a little bit of a book, of an overview of this book, written by a Black educator who teaches first and second graders and had used these books with first and second graders, just as Maria Walther had used all of her books with her students. So we went back to the resource examination tool and realized that this book had much better commitment and much better alignment to the district's and our network's vision of equity. And so we all took a deep breath and we said to Amanda and Leslie, are you willing to take the risk of moving from a book that we know was used well in previous intensives and moving to a book that we haven't used as much, that we haven't ever used, and trying to facilitate the use of a book whose title is Rebellious Read-Alouds. I'm sorry, this picture should be Rebellious Read-Alouds. And are we willing to make that change? And just even the title, Rebellious Read-Alouds, kind of brings people's attention to the world, right? And I often say the most rebellious thing about this book is the title, because the materials are really, really, I think, well suited for kindergarten, first and second graders in the area to meet some of those social justice standards. Not exactly totally rebellious, but it's a good title that the publishers determined. So I said to Amanda, I think Erin and I said, are you, Amanda and Leslie, are you willing to take the risk? And they said, sure we are. No, maybe they said, sure we are. And so here they are going to talk about what happened when they actually implemented this resource during their professional learning days.
Thank you, Susan, for that introduction. I think maybe both of those intonations are correct. We had some sure and some sure moments during our time. So Susan shared with you a lot of the preparation that we took as a team together prior to the intensive. And part of that preparation included sending the coaches and teachers who were participating in the intensive some materials to read ahead of time. For this particular intensive, they received an article about read-alouds from Dr. Tanya Wright and the introduction from the book, Rebellious Read-Alouds. So coming into our morning of professional learning based on Rebellious Read-Alouds, we anticipated that there might be some sensitive conversations, and we were coming into the morning not really sure of how the introduction had been received by all of the participating intensive members. And as teachers and coaches began their conversations using the provided protocol, we heard some comments that indicated there might be some hesitation about using the book when participants mentioned some personal, political, and religious stances. So while we were more nervous to facilitate the whole group discussion around rebellious read alouds than we ever had been when we were using Ramped Up, we leaned heavily on all of that deep thinking and the thoughtful process that we had employed using the examination tool. And while Leslie and I are here today describing a professional learning experience designed for coaches and teachers, you as coaches are often charged with providing professional learning for your teachers. And we are excited to share some of the things that we learned that might support you as you plan deep professional learning. I'll turn it over to Leslie.
Thank you. Next slide, Susan. So as our small group discussions began, we began to lean into the conversations that were being held. And we noticed there were some questions raised as to how this book was selected and who selected this book. And here's where it was really important to us to have utilized the resource examination tool, as well as garnered the approval of the building principal. And having done those steps prior to, it was really confirming for us. Through an earlier conversation with the building principal, the coaching group learned that she really prioritized everyone within the school as a family. And within that family, everyone is respected. They are taken care of and loved for who they are. And this message from the principal really connects to that whole theme and idea of rebellious read aloud, even though the title may not imply that. And so as conversations continued between the teachers and the coaches, the opportunity for us then as facilitators to share with the participants the connection between rebellious read aloud and the school's culture and vision, we were able to make that connection. And it really then led and opened up a more vulnerable and respectful discussion. And one coach recognized that using this resource would be valuable for all, saying it's good for kids and teachers. As the discussion continued, teachers began making connections between read aloud text featured in rebellious read aloud and their ELA curriculum. So all of these connections started to kind of take place once some more information was provided in the steps of the resource examination tool process.
So as we reflected on the emotions in the room and the initial discussions of the introduction to the resource, we came to the realization that had we introduced the book together, as opposed to sending out that small portion ahead of time, we may have avoided some of the hesitancy and some of the anxiety that we observed in participants and that we felt ourselves. When we only provided participants with the introduction of the book, we didn't paint the big picture of the importance of differences and how to respect them. Instead, if we had facilitated the introduction of the book all together, we could have highlighted the table of contents, we could have browsed the list of titles by topic, and we could have looked through some of the lessons that are provided to allow participants to have a deeper understanding of the resource as a whole and of how they might use that in their classrooms. So as we reflected and thought through some ways we could have improved implementing this new resources, here are some ideas we'd like to offer you to consider. If a new resource presents totally new ideas or ideas that might conflict with current practices, you might consider facilitating the introduction of the book. So highlighting the table of contents, highlighting the big ideas. If the new resource might be supplementing what's already been discussed in previous professional learning, or it is affirming a practice that teachers are already using, then it would be okay to share via email, followed up with a group discussion. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please, Susan. Thank you.
So After coaches and teachers had an opportunity to dig deeper into the rebellious read aloud, they were able to explore some of the picture books and the lessons that went along with those picture books. We heard some comments, things like, well, that was easier than I thought. I like the topics. And one teacher really stated, I love the idea of exposing students to differences and the ideas of those differences. One of the participating coaches who had raised heavy concerns with this book prior to our morning discussion shared this at the end of the group's conversation. It's important to respect the innocence and love of children. I realized these were beautiful books that connect to the heart. So after the coaches, afterward, the coaches had an opportunity to model a rebellious read aloud with a small group of students. There was greater appreciation for the value this resource provided. Coaches were delighted to share students' positive reactions and connections with the characters and the storylines within the books, and that was just really heartwarming and a relief for everyone involved. So as a result of this experience, we were really affirmed in our intentional planning and preparation for that professional learning session before, during, and the reflection process afterward. So when we were looking for ways to align our statewide literacy coach mission and vision within the local context, we know that all the resources and tools and protocols shared throughout our network can really provide those intentional lenses. And it specifically, in our experience, the importance of using the resource examination tool and aligning professional learning with the principal, the school vision, and the use of structured protocols really served us well.
Okay.
And I think that time to together, you know, when this network began, many of us were one-person teams, a team of one, and all of the time that we spent as a team planning together and using the resource examination tool and engaging in that deep discussion, I think that made the resource examination tool even more effective to be able to engage in that discussion as a planning team. And now that our network is so big and so many of us have teams to engage in this work, I feel that, thanks, Stacy. I feel that that collaboration in the planning was instrumental for us in the success of this resource.
So can you just tell us when you had that kind of feeling during the intensive, like, you know, as facilitators, of course we have little butterflies in our stomach, and you may have had many butterflies in your stomach for this resource, but can you just talk about when it was that you thought, okay, this is going to be okay?
I think that one's directed towards me because I was the facilitator of the conversation.
Oh.
The butterflies grew when we were observing and listening into the initial discussions. The butterflies were growing quite intensely for me. But as we started the whole group discussion, I just really leaned on the fact that because of all this careful planning, because we went through and used the resource examination tool, because we talked with the principal ahead of time, I felt prepared. I felt like I knew the reasons why we chose this. And that helped ease things a bit, and it helped me facilitate that discussion. And once we started engaging in the discussion and people had access to the whole book and could see everything, that's when I started to breathe a little bit easier. Leslie, would you have anything to add to that?
I think when Amanda opened it up for the first kind of response, and there was a small moment of silence, and a teacher smiled at Amanda, and so she said, I'm going to ask you because you smiled at me, and that participant's response was so positive, and that was the response of, I love the idea of sharing differences with students, and that set the tone. And from there on out, it was more of a collective positive conversation, and that's where it was. Whew, we're going in the right direction.
Yeah. So reading body language for sure during facilitation. And I promise you, I did have more people smiling at me after that too. So that was, that's good.
So I just want to really thank Amanda and Leslie for sharing this and for taking the risk to share it with all of you, and think about yourselves as coaches and professional developers, how you can use your good facilitating skills, as well as the resource examination tool and our commitment in our mission and vision when you're selecting resources. But I also want to say that no one resource is going to be perfect. And each of these books has really strong benefits. If you look at the section titles for Ramped Up Read Aloud, you could see that if you were really focusing on modeling comprehension strategies, like is in bullet 3 or 4 of Read Aloud, that some of these books might just be the perfect books for that. And notice how both of these books enable us to build text sets around either strategies or around ideas related to social justice. And I think that we just have to realize that in our intensive, we could only use one of these texts. But in your own professional life, on your own professional bookshelf, each of these books has its strengths, and each of them meets several of the alignment issues. So when you're thinking about what book should I use for which purpose, you really need to think about that and help teachers understand that in our professional library in our school, we're going to have both of these books because they both provide us with great ideas for read alouds. And this is how they're different, and this is how we could use them. So I think we have to really realize that not one book is going to solve every problem that we have in life, and or one podcast or one article or one other kind of video. So not everyone has its strengths and weaknesses. You just have to know before you go in what they are. So as Amanda says, you're prepared and you're very strong in why you're using this particular resource for this particular purpose. So we hope that you got a few key ideas from this panel, and look forward to hearing how some of the rest of you in future quarterlies are using the resource examination guide for your examination of a variety of resources. So I think it's either